Have you ever wondered why, even centuries after abolition, black people still carry so much pain? It's not just a matter of the past. It's a wound that was never treated. Slavery didn't start with chains. It started with ideas, dangerous ideas, like the one that said a skin color could determine the value of a life. This story isn't in school books. No one tells you that before the slave ship there was already contempt. That before the cotton plantation, there were already those who profited from black suffering. And even today, it hasn't ended. It just changed clothes. Racism doesn't scream, it whispers. In the data, in the stares, in the systems. You're about to understand why black people were chosen as targets, why their pain was planned, and why that pain still echoes. This video is an invitation to truth, to a deep, brave, and necessary journey. Because no one is born hating, but many learn to ignore. If you are black, this story is yours. If you're not, this story still involves you, because it shaped the world we all live in, and we can only change what we're brave enough to face. Welcome to the channel The Price of My Color. Here, color is not a reason for shame. It's a reason for struggle, memory, and pride. Before the chain tightened around the wrist, there was the gentle touch of freedom running between fingers. It was the sound of drums echoing through the villages, the smell of wet earth after the rain, the dances around the fire, the names full of meaning. Freedom wasn't a concept. It was a lived reality. People walked with open chests, knowing where they came from and where they were going. There was no fear of their own color. There was pride. What many don't understand is that Africa, before it was enslaved, was already a continent of kingdoms, science, and deep spirituality. Timbuktu had libraries when many still lived in caves. Black people didn't begin in the slave quarters. They began in royalty. But that was erased from the books, erased with blood, because telling that truth would threaten the structure of the white world that came after. The freedom that existed before the chain wasn't perfect. No society is. But it was dignified. It was human. When the chain was created, it didn't just bind bodies. It tried to imprison the soul, the history, the identity. That's when violence stopped being physical and became an attack against memory. And that's why, to this day, some people think black people never had a past, only pain. Imagine a people torn from everything. Land, language, gods, names, clothing, flavors, scents, beliefs. A people who suddenly were called things. And even so, they resisted. That's why you are here. Because even though they tried to break everything, they couldn't extinguish the spark of ancestry. It lives in you, in your gaze, in your posture, in your right to exist. The freedom that existed before the chain was silenced but not killed. And every time a black person raises their head, studies their history, walks with purpose, loves their skin, something from that ancient freedom awakens again. Because it never truly left, it was just hidden behind a lot of pain, waiting for someone to rediscover it. And if that freedom existed before the chain, what else was lost before the first lash? Which voices were silenced before the first ship set sail? What was there before the pain? That's where the next step of this story begins. And maybe the answer the whole world needs to face is exactly there. Before the cries of pain echoed in the ship holds, there was the voice. A strong, steady voice, teller of stories, myths, and ancient secrets passed from grandmother to grandson, from mother to daughter. A voice that sang at birth, that guided rituals, that blessed the harvest. The voice was a bridge to the divine, to the ancestors, to the community. It was living identity vibrating in the air. Colonization didn't start with shackles, it started with silence, with the imposition of another language, another logic, another religion. Silencing the voice was the first abduction, because taking a people's language is taking their compass. Those who can't speak their own words can no longer recognize their path, and the black voice was ripped from their throats. And even so, it survived, in the lullabies that crossed the ocean, in the laments hidden behind the drumbeats, in the language disguised as religion, as resistance. Every knot in a head wrap, every move in a capoeira circle, every beat of a drum is a code. An echo of that ancient voice, suffocated but never silenced. That voice reinvented itself. How many times has a black man had to swallow his opinion just to survive? How many times has a black woman been interrupted, ignored, rendered invisible? The black voice is still treated as disruptive when it shouts, but it's also ignored when it whispers. And in that back and forth of selective listening, structural racism keeps operating, silently but fatally. Today, when a young black person speaks, they carry centuries inside their chest. Every sentence spoken with courage is a rescue. Every poem, every speech, every time a black child says, "I can," is a reconnection. Because before the scream, there was the voice. And before the pain, there was the word, free, full of truth and belonging. But Guy, what happens when that voice is ignored? When no one wants to listen? What happens when an entire society learns to cover its ears to what truly matters? The answer may lie in the next chapter of this journey. Before pain marked the skin, there was color. A warm, deep glow full of history, strength and beauty, the tone of wet earth, of noble ebony, of skin that absorbs the sun and transforms it into ancestral energy. Black color was not a problem, it was power. It was a symbol of royalty, of identity, of a beauty that didn't need permission to exist. But the white world didn't know how to deal with that. Color became a threat. It started being seen with suspicion, with fear, with contempt. Society decided that black color needed to be controlled, erased, whitened. That's when the pain entered. The pain didn't come from the skin itself. It came from the gaze that decided that color couldn't be worth as much as another. The pain began the moment color became a target, and from there it took on many forms, in segregation, in insults, in exclusion, in jokes disguised as humor, in the glance that avoids eye contact in an elevator. Color became a reason for surveillance. Being black became a synonym for danger, not because of what it was, but because of how it was seen. And that's where the absurdity lies. The same society that profited from black bodies now pretends not to see their wounds. It talks about meritocracy, but refuses to acknowledge that some started the race with their legs already tied. And meanwhile, the suffering lingers, not just in the body, but in the soul. The color that was once a symbol of life became a memory of pain, but not by its own choice. Even with all that, color resists. It lives in art, in fashion, in music, in faith, in the way people walk, smile, take care of their own. Color pulses, lives, teaches. Every shade of black skin is a map of a history not told in books, but tattooed in flesh, not as a wound, but as memory. Memory that insists on saying, "I exist, and I exist with pride." But what happened to turn such a rich, life-filled color into a symbol of pain? What kind of system decided to reduce an entire color to a stigma? The answer might be found in the very first moment that color was devalued. No one is born a slave. No one is born to have their worth measured in coins or in pounds. But at some dark point in history, someone looked at another human being and didn't see a brother. They saw a resource. They saw profit. And black skin started being treated like merchandise. That was the beginning of one of the most shameful chapters in human history. The moment when color became currency. That someone wasn't a lone monster. It was an entire system. It was kings, it was merchants, it was the church, it was empires. It was treaties, laws, and ports overflowing. It was a world built around the idea that some were born to rule and others to obey. That's when slave ships emerged. Auctions began, bodies were branded, names were replaced. Erasure became official policy. Thousands were torn from their villages, their families, their dreams. It wasn't just a kidnapping of bodies. It was the theft of humanity. And still, amid the terror of the slave trade, there was resistance. There were those who jumped off the ships, who sang so they wouldn't forget, who birthed hope in the dark belly of a vessel, who planted dignity in foreign soil. Black slavery was systematic, global, and brutal. It wasn't an accident nor an exception. It was a project. And every country that participated, from Brazil to the United States, from Europe to African colonies, carries that stain. You can't talk about history without talking about slavery. And you can't talk about slavery without understanding that it shaped the structural racism still in place today. But there's something that hurts even more. Many try to justify it. They say it was normal at the time, that everyone did it, that it ended long ago. But historical pain has no expiration date. The impact of slavery is in the absences, in the names we don't know, the stories we weren't told, the families that were torn apart by force. And the question that won't go away is, how could something so cruel last for so long? What made this system of horror become acceptable for centuries? Maybe the answer lies in how humanity began to perceive difference. It didn't happen overnight. Slavery didn't begin with chains. It began with ideas. First came the belief that some were superior. Then, the justification that others needed to be civilized. And just like that, drop by drop, cruelty turned into a system that transformed difference into an excuse for exploitation. That's how it all started, with a crooked gaze, with silence in the face of injustice, with greed speaking louder than compassion. Black slavery wasn't born out of nowhere. It was fed by centuries of dehumanization, backed by law, religion, and commerce. It was institutionalized, normalized, until it seemed natural, and that's what made it so perverse. It's true that slavery existed in the ancient world, but with black people, it was different. It wasn't just forced labor, it was erasure. It was brutality as a rule, humiliation as policy, dehumanization as strategy. It was a slavery designed to last, to span generations, to make freedom the exception, and it shaped entire continents. The transatlantic trade was the bridge of horror. Millions were thrown into the sea, erased from memory as if they had never existed. Every body taken was a stolen story, a silenced language, an interrupted culture, and even so, the seed of resistance grew with every chained step. The fight didn't begin with abolition. It began with the first whispered no in the hold. The truth is, slavery went so deep that even after its official end, it continued under new names. It continued in institutional racism, in inequality, in denied access, in stolen opportunities. The chain became structure. The ship became system, and that's why the pain still lives on, even in free bodies. But if that's how it all began, how does it end? Does this story have an ending, or does it just change form? Maybe the key lies in looking at where it all spread, and how it still shapes the world today. It's common to believe that the story of black slavery began when the ship set sail toward the Americas. But that's just one part of the narrative. The truth is, this story started much earlier, when European empires decided to explore the world, hungry for power. The slave ship was only the visible tip of an iceberg, built with greed and racist ideologies. Even before the first ship sailed, treaties were being signed, pacts of blood, trade, and silence. The transatlantic slave trade became the gear of a global exploitation system. Portugal, Spain, England, France, all profited. Africa was divided like merchandise, and black people reduced to numbers in accounting books. The pain didn't start only in the belly of the ships. It began when the first tribal leader was forced to hand over his people under threat. It began when African kingdoms saw their borders dissolve under the weight of European gold and guns. It began when ancestral spirituality was labeled paganism, when culture became something to be corrected or destroyed. Ancient slavery existed in many cultures, in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Rome. But even then, there were still chances for upward mobility, for buying freedom, for recognition. With black people, a new logic emerged, the idea that skin color determined who was human and who wasn't. That was the tragic turning point in history, the origin of modern racism. And that's why, as symbolic as it is, the slave ship doesn't explain everything. It was a consequence, not the cause. The structure that allowed that horror had already been in motion for centuries. And if we don't go that far back, we can't understand the present. Because the racism that hurts today was born long before any ship crossed the Atlantic Ocean. So then, if the origin of black slavery is older than we think, what about the places where it was legitimized? What kind of society allowed and even celebrated that kind of violence? The answer may lie in the empires that used faith as a tool for domination. Every time difference is seen as a threat, injustice is born. That's how it started. When someone looked at the other and saw not richness, but risk. When diversity stopped being a strength and became a target. That is the root. Before slavery, before chains, came fear disguised as power. The fear of what is not understood, not controlled, and black people became the target. This logic spread like a plague. Entire peoples began to be measured by one standard. Do they look like me or not? Skin, hair, language, religion, everything became a reason to judge. And where there was no real threat, one was invented. Because it's easier to justify domination when you turn the victim into the problem. That's the oppression playbook. The great empires knew that. That's why they ruled through fear. They associated dark skin with ignorance, savagery, and curse. They created narratives, drew maps, distorted history, and behind all of that they hid the truth. Difference was never the threat. It was just the excuse. The real motive was always control. Europe in its expansion needed justification. It wasn't enough to dominate, they had to convince. And so difference was demonized. Africa, once the cradle of ancient civilizations, became a continent to be discovered. Black people, once kings in their own lands, became enslaved in foreign ones. All of this built upon a lie repeated until it became rule. What's most cruel is how that way of thinking infected the world. Even today, in the 21st century, there are still those who see difference as a threat. Still those who are bothered by a black person at the top, by a black woman in leadership, by a black child dreaming big. And it all comes from that point of origin, when humanity decided that different meant dangerous. But what if difference was seen as richness, as something to celebrate instead of fear? What would the world be like if back then they had chosen empathy over domination? Maybe that reflection takes us straight to the empires that profited most from that fabricated threat. Suffering wasn't always a matter of skin color, but one day, power made a choice. It chose who would suffer more, who would have less, who would be disposable. And that criteria wasn't random. It was calculated. They chose black skin because it was resilient, because it was strong, because it produced, but also because, in the eyes of the dominators, it could be marked without guilt. When power selects a color to suffer, it also selects another to rule. That's how racism is born, not from open hatred, but from silent privilege. From the idea that there's a natural hierarchy, that some are born to serve and others to be served. This logic seeped into laws, churches, universities, and mindsets. Black suffering became the standard. It became a statistic. It became routine. Meanwhile, those in power said, "It's not my problem. It's not my fault. That's in the past." But those who suffer today feel it now. Time doesn't ease pain when the pain is continuous. And the cruelest part? Power keeps choosing. It chooses who lives where, who lives how long, who matters more. The color of suffering is tattooed in the data, in neighborhoods without sanitation, in schools without structure, in prisons overcrowded with black bodies, in hospitals where black pain is dismissed, in the absence of black people in positions of decision-making. All of that is the reflection of a choice. The choice by power of who will carry the weight of the world on their backs. And even so, black people resist. They suffer, but they transform. They fall, but they rise. They laugh, even with tired eyes. And in that resilience lies the greatest threat to the system, living proof that imposed suffering did not win, that pain did not kill dignity, that the color of suffering is also the color of overcoming. But if power chose the color of suffering, who will choose the color of reparation? Who will retell this story, giving names to the silences? Maybe the next step is to revisit the places where all of this began to be institutionalized, the ancient empires. Slavery wasn't born in the modern era. In the Middle East, ancient Egypt, Greece, and Rome, men and women were already treated as property. But there were important differences. In many of those places, an enslaved person could buy freedom, have a family, even hold respected positions. They weren't second-class humans. They were subordinate, but not erased. In Egypt, for example, some enslaved people worked as artisans, scribes, even advisors. In Greece, many taught philosophy or cared for the home as part of the family structure. In Rome, it was possible to rise, to earn citizenship, to rebuild a life. It was still unjust, but it wasn't built to erase identities based on skin color. The brutal shift came with African slavery. Here, the logic was different. The black person wasn't just labor. They were animalized, stripped of name, culture, and soul. That didn't exist on such a large scale in ancient models. The slave trade inaugurated a new form of slavery, one that destroyed not only the body, but the spirit, and humanity accepted it. The ancient empires used slavery as a tool of domination, but they didn't invent racism as we know it. That was the invention of modernity, of colonization. That's when skin color became a social marker, a symbol of inferiority, a religious and economic justification. That's when everything escalated and spread like a plague. The most perverse part is that this transition happened naturally. Society slowly accepted century after century the idea that black people were less, that they weren't equal, that they could be owned. Modern slavery learned from the ancients, but took cruelty to another level, and that model bled entire continents. And even today, that blood still stains the sidewalks of major cities. But what happened to the body also happened to the soul. When black skin entered the equation, pain gained another dimension. And if ancient slavery allowed room for a new beginning, modern slavery sought to erase all hope. And that's where we reach the point where pain stopped being exploitation and became dehumanization. To brand a human being as property is more than violence. It's the total denial of existence. Black men and women were marked with hot irons, forced tattoos, cuts, numbers. Skin became a receipt. A body became a contract. It was the slave owner's way of saying, "You belong to me." And the world accepted that as normal. Black women suffered even more. Forced labor wasn't enough. They were assaulted, exposed, used as sexual objects. Their children torn from their arms, their bodies treated as utility. And even so, they created resistance through their gaze, in the way they cared for others' children, in whispered prayers at night. They never stopped being human, even when they were told otherwise. Black men, on the other hand, were reduced to brute strength, their emotions ignored, their affections silenced. Sensitivity was seen as weakness, and weakness as a reason for punishment, and so they were shaped into a mold that wasn't theirs. Many still carry that invisible pain, the pain of never having had the right to simply feel. By branding a body, the system wanted more than ownership. It wanted to destroy memory, to erase origins, to forget the African name, to rewrite history with European ink, imposed surnames, forced baptisms, forbidden languages. All of this was part of the same plan, to reprogram the black person so they would stop recognizing themselves. Those marks didn't fade with time. They changed form. Today, they're the cameras that follow more closely. The ignored resumes, the store searches, the uneasy glances in elevators. The physical brand became a structural one, invisible to those who don't feel it in their skin, but painfully obvious to those who carry in their chest the memory of being seen as a thing. And if even today there are people who say slavery is in the past, maybe they've never really looked at those marks, because the black body still carries scars that were never chosen. And understanding that is the first step to realizing that even without visible chains, the weight remains. But did it ever really fall? For a long time, slavery was based on war, debt, domination between peoples. But there were nuances. There was still, even if minimal, some notion of humanity. When black skin entered the equation, everything changed. Color became the reason in itself. It no longer mattered what a person did or didn't do. The crime was simply existing in the wrong skin. Black slavery wasn't just economic, it was ideological. Dark skin came to symbolize everything the so-called civilized world wanted to reject: savagery, ugliness, inferiority. It was a global project of dehumanization. The black body was seen as a tool, the black smile as defiance, black intelligence as a threat, black suffering as tolerable. It was from that equation that violence intensified, the punishments became crueler, the conditions more inhumane. The gaze upon black people stopped being individual. It became collective, a label, a sentence. The world began to see black people as one block. No names, no voices, no right to personal pain. That's what makes this wound so deep. Skin became a signal, an alert for the system, a code for denied access. When color is turned into a target, it's no longer just biological, it becomes political. Black people began life in debt, owing explanation, posture, humility, gratitude. Gratitude for what? For being tolerated? For surviving? The world demanded gratitude from those who only asked for respect, and even today that logic persists. When a black person succeeds, some say it's an exception. When a black person reacts to injustice, they're labeled aggressive. When a black person demands space, they're called a victim. All of this comes from that old equation, the one that tied skin color to pain as an inevitable destiny. But that equation needs to be broken. Because if pain reached a new level with the entrance of black skin, what can be said of the resistance born from that pain? How do you explain the strength of someone who, even crushed, stood back up? Maybe now is the time to remember what came after the chain, when finally it fell, but didn't take the scars with it. To exploit someone is cruel, but to dehumanize is a step further. Black slavery crossed that line. It wasn't just about extracting labor. It was about erasing the soul. The system wasn't satisfied with using the body. It needed to destroy identity. That's when everything became darker. Pain became strategy. Humiliation became routine. Dignity was stripped away as if it never mattered. To dehumanize is to turn a human being into an object. It's to look and not see a person, but a number, a function, a profit. And that's what happened to black people in every corner of the world, in the slave quarters, in the fields, at the whipping post, in the sale of children, in the separation of families. It was the logic of the market. How much is a strong body worth? How much does a fertile woman produce? What does it cost to break a spirit? This dehumanization wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. African names were taken, native languages were forbidden, religions were mocked, gods were demonized. They were taught that everything from Africa was wrong, ugly, dirty. The goal was clear: break the connection between black people and their history. A people without memory is easier to control. And the most perverse part, this was taught for centuries as if it were normal. Schools repeated it, churches blessed it, laws reinforced it. An entire society participated in this violent lie. And even after abolition, the dehumanization continued. It just changed clothes. It started being called lack of opportunity, low performance, suspicious profile. But it was the same racism in a different disguise. Slavery-based exploitation could be measured in profits. But dehumanization, that has no price. It's an unpayable debt. It's in the anonymous faces, in the untold stories, in the lives interrupted before they ever began. It's in the pain that many still carry without knowing where it comes from. An inherited pain, a collective pain. But if dehumanization was a strategy, could rehumanization be one too? How do you recover what generations tried to erase? Maybe the answer lies in truly listening, really listening to the voices that still carry those scars today. Now that you've heard this story, let me ask you something. How many times have you felt like you had to be twice as good just to earn half the respect? How many doors closed before you even had the chance to knock? How many times did you swallow your tears just to keep being strong? This isn't just a story of pain. It's a story of resilience. Every black body that breathes, dreams, and resists today is a miracle that defied centuries of oppression. But this fight isn't only in the past. It's alive every day, in the streets, in the workplace, in interrupted dreams, and also in the dreams that refuse to die. So, if this story spoke to you, leave your comment down below. Share your experience, your pain, or your hope. Here, your voice won't be ignored. Here, every word is a seed for change. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and share this video with someone who needs to understand that being black isn't just about surviving. It's about resisting with dignity. This channel is made by us, for us, but also for those who are ready to truly hear what the world spent so long pretending not to see. And remember, every time you lift your head, you honor those who came before and clear the path for those who come next.